Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with Food for You and the Planet. Today's episode features Tim Cruz, PhD, Chief Scientist and Director of the International Initiative at the Land Institute. Tim is at the Land Institute because, in his words, the work is the most focused and far-reaching of any organization I know. It promises to transform agriculture from being an ecological liability to an asset. Tim first visited the Land Institute in 1981 after reading New Roots for Agriculture as an undergraduate majoring in agroecology at the University of California-Santa Cruz. Over the next 3 decades, he pursued a doctorate degree at Cornell, carried out a postdoc fellowship at Stanford, and developed an agroecology program at Prescott College in northern Arizona. But all along, he continued to track the work of the Land Institute, and in 2000, began to collaborate directly. In 2012, Tim joined the staff as Director of Research and an ecologist. He helps facilitate and coordinate the research efforts of his colleagues and conducts work on the ecosystem functions performed by soils. Thank you so much for being here today, Tim.
Well, thank you, Rosemary. It's great to be here on this chilly winter morning.
So what is the Land Institute and what type of work does it do?
Well, the Land Institute is a nonprofit agricultural research organization located in Salina, Kansas. It was founded in 1976 by Wes and Dana Jackson, so it's almost 50 years old. But all along, it has, rather than address kind of the current most urgent challenges that agriculture faces, either conventional or organic, Wes Jackson and many people along the way have stepped back and opted to look at nature's ecosystems generally, grasslands, forests, savannas, tundra, deserts, and asked, what is it that makes these ecosystems function? What is critical in those ecosystems that's lacking from our agricultural systems? And the two prominent things missing are roots in the ground year-round and biodiversity. So around here in Kansas, when you drive on the interstate or anywhere, actually, you'll see vast fields of annual grains, monocropped grains, one species of annual plants. And with that comes a whole host of implications that we'll get into.
How did you become interested in sustainable agriculture?
I would garden with my dad in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I grew up, and and then also read The Unsettling of America by Wendell Berry when it first came out in 1977. I was in the Rodale Book of the Month Club. It came to me without me even asking. It came because I forgot to send my card in to tell them not to send that book, whatever that was. But I was changed by that book, as many have been. Made me look for universities that had something to do with alternative agriculture, and there weren't very many obvious programs at that time. And I ended up going to University of California-Santa Cruz, as you mentioned, that has a well-known farm and garden apprenticeship program, which I did. I did that apprenticeship. It was fabulous. But during it, I started to notice something that bothered me, or at least made me wonder, why is it that in this very sustainable horticulture program, we see truck after truck deliver mushroom compost and manures to maintain the fertility of these soils. And I was like, what's the deal with that? Traditional farming systems and indigenous farming systems certainly did not have those imports of organic nutrients. And when I thought through it, I'd be like, well, those manures come from feed in many cases that were grown with synthetic fertilizers. So it was kind of like dumpster diving for nutrients or laundering synthetic nutrients to maintain organic agriculture, which happens all the time in this country and around the world. Not bad because we need to use those nutrients again, but we're fooling ourselves to think that it is ultimately sustainable. And therefore, I went on a quest to figure that out, which led me to studying traditional farming systems in Mexico as an undergraduate and for my PhD to understand how soil fertility was maintained without the input of synthetic fertilizers over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
What types of research efforts do you lead at the Land Institute?
Well, I used to be directing the soil ecology program, and now we have a really competent, excellent lead researcher, Laura Vanderpool, doing that job, looking to understand how changing from annual cropping to perennial influences all sorts of soil functions, carbon capture, water and nutrient uptake, things like this. As well as how we might intercrop perennial species to achieve different levels of ecological function or ecological intensification. So I did that for quite a few years, but in the last few years, I've shifted my focus to directing the international initiative that you've mentioned, and that is where we're inviting researchers from around the world to play some role in developing perennial grain agriculture, and in particular with an emphasis on plant breeding, which is needed to do anything else in this area. But yeah, we're recruiting people to work on really any aspect, though, soil ecology to social adoption, you name it.
What are some of the greatest challenges related to achieving sustainable agriculture system?
Well, one that I think about a lot, and partly because many people don't, I'd be interested to inventory the podcast and hear how many people raise energy as a linchpin of sustainable agriculture. Right now, in the US and in other industrialized nations, conventional and organic agriculture depend profoundly on fossil fuels. I mean, in grain agriculture, to the tune of over 99% of the energy expended to grow the food comes from fossil fuels, whether it's in the form of synthetic fertilizers or the type of, manures that are, gathered in different feedlots or even small scale operations. Just the act of hauling dump truck after dump truck load of manure out to a field to spread it is an incredible expenditure of energy, and as is the constant tillage with tractors in organic production systems. We depend so deeply on it, and it's partly because fossil fuels have allowed people to relocate themselves away from where agriculture actually makes sense into regions that were not conducive to agriculture, but we've been able to move there and either ship the food in, or now that there's an interest in local foods, boy, we expect that you should be able to produce good organic local food wherever we are. And that's kind of ridiculous, actually, because not all places are really well suited for sustainable agricultural production. So energy, whenever we think about solutions, it's, I think, critical to think of what are the energetic ramifications, and does that reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? And ultimately, we should have a food system that achieves more capture of calories than we expend in growing the food. I mean, before fossil fuels, that was an essential equation. If we didn't get more energy back than we expended growing the food, we would die because we would just starve. You don't produce enough to feed yourself the next year. But in the last 200 years, since we've decoupled the energy in the food we eat from the actual act of growing the food, we've basically made a very ludicrous landscape when it comes to producing our food, something that no other organism on the planet has achieved. And it's getting us into a lot of trouble, as we know, with climate change. So you asked me that question, that was maybe more than you bargained for, but I think it's extremely undervalued, especially in the conversation around climate change. I mean, we need to reduce the energy expense of all of our food.
So a potential solution could be using perennial crops. So what are perennial crops and why are they important?
That was a great segue. Yes, having a crop that you don't need to, well, let me just say, to grow annual crops, you need to eliminate pretty much all the vegetation on the landscape on an annual basis. That's done these days either through tractor tillage in industrialized nations, with animal tillage in some indigenous systems that exist around the world. But one way or the other, it's a lot of energy to kill all the vegetation in order to then sow the seed of your annual crop every year. You start your plants again and again by seed, and you need to kill everything to reduce the competition, allowing your annual crop to grow. Now, this seems all very natural and logical to us humans in the last 10,000 years, but around the world, there's no major ecosystem that is predominantly made up of annual plants. They're all perennials, grasslands, forests, tundra, all of them. And the few moments that they are annual, like after an extreme disturbance, a fire or a landslide, boy, annuals are incredible at getting in there, holding the soil while perennials start to move back in and take over and ultimately outcompete the annuals. Only about 6% of the Earth's plant species are annuals, interestingly. But virtually all of our food producing ecosystem is annual. And when we would, back in the day, when we had a much lower population, we being humans, agriculture was practiced in small patches that would appear and disappear on the landscape. And the natural systems could kind of recolonize that, almost like a little wound where you've opened up the skin, if you will, of the earth to plant our annual seeds. Eventually, mainly because of fertility restrictions, that would close up again in a fallow or some other perennial vegetation. And so, but once we got the population that we have, and once we achieved our understanding of fossil fuels, we can maintain vast landscapes in annual production, which means soils are exposed, they erode faster than they're being formed in most cases. They leak nutrients because there are not roots in the ground for substantial periods of time to capture nutrients. And oftentimes because of the tillage that we use to kill vegetation, it disrupts the soil structure. And so you often have lower rates of water capture, water infiltration into the soil when you every year go through and till the soil and break up aggregates and basically disrupt the structure of a well-formed soil like exists under forests or grasslands or other perennial ecosystems. So by shifting to a perennial grain, and grains comprise about 70% of the land dedicated to annual agriculture, you start to recapture what made those soils develop in the first place. We sometimes say here at the Land Institute, where there's a lot of interest in regenerative agriculture. And we're like, well, if you want to regenerate the soil, mirror what generated the soil in the first place. And that is these ecosystems that are perennial.
What are some of the main perennial crops you study, and how can they be incorporated into sustainable agriculture systems?
So the challenge of what we're doing is that it takes a lot of time to develop a new crop species. There have not been very many new crops introduced into the human diet in the last several hundred years. Regionally, there have been where we've taken one and introduced it into another place. Quinoa came into the US from South America in my lifetime, things like that. But in terms of actually domesticating what was a wild species and now making it an agricultural crop, or arriving at a perennial in a different way, such as crossing a wild perennial plant with an existing annual crop like wheat or sorghum or rice, which is a technique that's being used right now. All of them take more time than our society really likes to deal with. It's like the cure for cancer is on the same time frame as developing new crops. And it actually takes a lot of time to develop even a new variety of tomato or corn, but that's just all happening in the background and people aren't really aware, and it's not that exciting. So it's just kind of happening, and seed companies do that. But seed companies haven't taken a real strong interest in developing perennial grain crops. I wonder why. Well, you don't have to plant them every year or every other year or every third year. There's not a huge incentive for that development to take place. And land-grant universities primarily work for the for-profit part of the world right now, and there's not a lot of plant breeders that are independent working in land grants that have the freedom and funding to dedicate to something like perennial grains. All of that is to say that there are a handful of species that are being worked on. They're all in a different kind of place in the pipeline of crop development. We have perennial wheat and sorghum at the Land Institute that we're working on, and that I just mentioned. Rice is probably the most successful perennial grain crop that has been developed in the Yunnan province of China. And they've actually achieved yields that are now very similar to the annual rice in the region. And they've had harvests 8 in a row over 4 years, 2 per year, which is just remarkable. It's never happened before in the history of agriculture in 10,000 years to have something like that. And it's phenomenal. The crop that we're working on that has the greatest recognition right now is called Kernza. It's a relative of wheat, and it's a domestication. So it's not one of these crosses where we're able to take advantage of all of this breeding, both incidental breeding done by just farmers over the centuries, as well as modern scientific breeding in the last 80 years. We're able, in a wide hybrid cross, you can take advantage of that by moving the perennial genes through cross-pollination into an annual wheat, for example. So you can if the genetics work, you can jumpstart a perennial crop much more quickly that way. If you're starting from a wild species, then my gosh, you're doing what kind of Neolithic farmers did 10,000 years ago by just doing cycles of selection, albeit greatly informed through a more scientific understanding of how crop breeding works. It's still very, very slow to domesticate a new crop species. But Kernza is an example of that. And it's a relative of wheat. It's very much a work in progress, but it's out in the world, and it's in products that Patagonia Provisions makes, General Mills makes. There's a lot of beer companies out there that are using Kernza in products, and even locally here that we can get pasta or rolled Kernza, like rolled oats. It's great. A couple of other species, though, that are being worked on as new domestication projects at the Land Institute are silflower, which is in the sunflower family. It's an oil seed crop, very deep rooted, that's being bred for cooking oil. That would take the place, for example, of sunflower oil or soy oil or another vegetable oil. And then there's baki bean, which is the seed of the legume sainfoin. It's both a forage and a grain-producing crop that we see as being like a lentil for a pulse, where you could eat it directly as a pulse or in a flour as just a plant protein. And so those are some of the species that we're working on. There's a perennial barley, a perennial flax, pigeon pea. There's a handful of other crops. Recently, we've started working with a group in Bolivia that's starting to develop a perennial quinoa, and that's extremely exciting as well. So we need, though, more perennial crops in order to have the diversity to create functional crop communities or polycultures or intercrops, thus achieve what we call ecological intensification. So it's not simply trying to replace one monoculture of annual crops with a monoculture of perennials. Our vision is to diversify the cropping system in various ways to achieve a higher degree of functionality in the cropping system itself.
How do you do the plant breeding, and how does that differ from GMOs, genetically modified organisms? So
Yeah,
how is what you're doing different than something that genetic scientists may be?
right. At the Land Institute, most of the work has historically been where you cross-pollinate a population that has been selected for various attributes that we're looking for. So something as simple as yield, something like non-shattering, where wild plants tend to drop their seed at the end of the growing season, and it's what's called an early domestication trait, where, okay, obviously we want to go out and select the plants that do not drop their seed at the end of the growing season. So that's fundamental. And then disease resistance, and any free threshing. There's various traits that are all being selected at the same time. You cross-pollinate them, and then you plant those out. You look for the best ones, select them, cross-pollinate them, plant them out. That's very traditional, but more recently, we've started to look into the plant's DNA, because it's now possible, and use what's called molecular markers, or whole swarms of markers, into what's called genomic selection, where you can select on many traits by looking at the DNA of seedlings and see if traits that you want are in that plant before you spend 3 years growing them out, using all sorts of intern and researcher time to collect them and measure them and weigh them and photograph them, all the seeds that we do. Why grow them out when you know the trait is not there in the first place? And we can do that with many of these species. So Kernza in particular has a very advanced genomic selection program, and we're working on developing those for the other species that we're working on. So that will accelerate, that has accelerated progress in Kernza, and we think will dramatically in some of the other species. There are people in the world working on using targeted mutagenesis through CRISPR on some of the crops. Kernza in Copenhagen, there's a lab looking at that with Kernza. Excuse me. And that's a whole conversation about the degree to which targeted mutagenesis, that's not transgenics. You're not bringing a gene from another species or another kingdom into your plant. You are inducing mutations at a particular place in the plant to see if you can get a plant that doesn't have a brittle stem like the perennial barley does in Sweden. And if you can find a mutation, then if you can develop a mutation, then you could either incorporate that into the breeding program, or as they're doing in Denmark, then they go out and they look for that mutation in another way, because gene editing is not legal to use in crop breeding in the EU yet. It's a longer conversation. Mutagenesis, as you probably know, is used chemically and radioactively in many crops. Almost every crop we eat, including organic crops, have experienced some degree of mutagenesis in their background. It's a classic traditional plant breeding approach, but it's not targeted. And so we have accepted, maybe ignorant, not knowing that this plant breeding technique has and continues to be used all the time to accelerate the rate of diversity in the crops that we're selecting on, as opposed to simply relying on natural mutation rates, which occur in all organisms, to get the diversity that we're going to draw off of to make a big apple or a big watermelon, or, these are all mutants. We eat mutants, by the way. They're all kind of freaks of nature when it comes to what you see out in out in wild ecosystems. So we've selected on weird mutations through natural mutations. And right now, there's a huge discussion of whether targeted mutagenesis through CRISPR constitutes a GMO, or is it actually kind of mimicking nature, just kind of accentuating what nature does through mutations, which happen all the time. I'm interested in what you think and what the audience thinks. We're not doing it at the Land Institute, by the way, but we're interested in a group that is exploring it to see if the very slow process of developing perennial grains can be accelerated through techniques like this, just because we actually think the sustainability of agriculture at the scale that we're practicing it on the earth today is not sustainable. And therefore we're really interested in what might accelerate this work to help heal, to capture carbon, to basically make our food producing ecosystem more like the rest of the ecosystems around the world.
What is the Global Inventory Project?
That is a project that one of our colleagues, Allison Miller, and her lab group, she is at the Danforth Center and St. Louis University, but also has an appointment at the Missouri Botanic Garden. And really, a lot of this work had happened at the Missouri Botanic Garden. And it was really an effort to document the diversity of 3 plant families: the legume family, the sunflower family, and the grass family, which encompass most of our grains. we define, and many people do, as plants that produce seed, herbaceous plants that produce seed. Cereals are the grasses like oats and wheat and corn. Grains also include legumes like beans and peas, as well as some oil seeds. And so the global inventory was an attempt to get a whole list of what perennial plants exist in the world that might be candidates for perennial grains, so that people who are interested in maybe working on a perennial grain can go to that inventory and see in their region what might make sense to start working on, or at least get some ideas.
What is ecological intensification?
Yeah, I've mentioned it a couple of times. Ecological intensification, in one way of defining it, would be how we can use ecological processes to replace the need for purchased inputs that are either pesticides that might be toxic, or inputs that are very energy expensive and disrupt the environment, like fertilizers. And so how can you get ecological processes to reduce the need for those? So a farming system that fertilizes itself or has diversity guard against insect or disease infestations, as opposed to using fungicides or pesticides. So yeah, broadly or simplistically speaking, that is ecological intensification.
What is perennial polyculture?
Yeah, a polyculture is a key version of ecological intensification, in that we've talked about monocultures being one species on the landscape. A polyculture is really more than one species on the landscape. And a well-designed polyculture is going to find species that have certain relationships that are beneficial to one or both. A classic is a legume and a cereal, where the legume can fix nitrogen and the cereal can benefit from that fixed nitrogen. But there's many other examples, and a polyculture does not necessarily mean that the plants are growing right next to each other. There might be an alley cropping system with trees going down the side of fields that enhances diversity, and that would be a polyculture. So people have a fairly narrow vision that intercropping polycultures involve many species growing right next to each other, and that isn't necessarily the case in the definition, but yeah.
So you've talked quite a bit about soil health. So how do perennial crops improve soil health?
One huge thing that they do is they tend to recapture soil organic matter, which is maybe 58% carbon. So when we talk about soil organic carbon, that's pretty synonymous with soil organic matter, because most of the organic matter is carbon. Recapturing the carbon that was lost when the natural ecosystem was converted to the annual agricultural system. When you disturb the soil, plow it up, you break open these aggregates, these soil clods that physically and chemically protect organic matter inside of them. And so when you break them open, it allows for microbes to get in there and feast on that newly exposed soil carbon, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. And so disturbing the soil tends to cause drastic losses of soil organic matter. Meanwhile, the inputs of carbon into that soil are reduced when you trade deep-rooted perennial species like grasslands or forest trees with annual crops. Annual crops don't allocate nearly as much of their carbon below ground. And so you tend not to have nearly as much carbon input, more carbon loss because of the soil disturbance, resulting in what is known to be the case, and that is about half, plus or minus, of the soil organic matter in most annual tilled agricultural soils has gone back up into the atmosphere. And so by replanting perennials, and if you can plant them in polycultures like with legumes, you tend to start to rapidly reaccumulate, I say rapidly, relatively rapidly reaccumulate the soil carbon that was lost when you converted a perennial system to an annual. So that's huge in terms of soil health, because kind of the holy grail of soil health is soil organic matter. But I will add that other things that change is when you develop those aggregates again that protect the soil organic matter, that also results in a soil structure that influences infiltration rates. You're able to capture rain and have it go down into the soil rather than run off the surface. And with climate change, as storms become more intense and maybe less frequent, more erratic, you have a greater chance of infiltrating a lot more water from an intense storm. And then you have the deep roots to access a larger soil volume around year-round in that soil water that was maybe captured. And so you don't have these situations maybe where in certain parts of the world, when it comes to be springtime, you need timely rains to germinate that seed. And if you don't get them exactly in the right month, you may not have a crop with more erratic weather. Whereas with a perennial, it's already there. It can start to use stored soil water until maybe hopefully you do get some rain. Alternatively, if the field is super muddy, like exists in the Midwest many years, and you can't get in there to prepare the fields. Similarly, if you have a perennial field already growing, you don't need to worry about that nearly as much. So it improves the flexibility substantially of the farming system.
How does soil health relate to climate? I know this is a really important topic right now, and there's a bit of debate about how much carbon can actually be sequestered from the atmosphere through regenerative organic systems. So yeah, could you tell everybody a little bit more about how soil health relates to climate and the magnitude of its importance?
Yeah. I would say that the potential to draw down atmospheric carbon into the soil has very important implications when it comes to dealing with excess carbon in the atmosphere. So soil drawdown will not fix climate change. In fact, it is a very serious error to suggest that somehow we mainly just need to deal with regenerative ag and then climate change is fixed. That is completely wrong. And we absolutely have to deal with our fossil fuel use foremost. Now, that said, if we were to stop using fossil fuels today, we have this legacy of excess carbon dioxide. It's in the oceans, it's in the atmosphere, and we need to draw it down also. And so let's put it back in some of the compartments where it came from. And that is soil carbon, that is soil in biomass of trees. It's in a number of places. We need to pursue all methods that we can to pull some of that carbon out. And in terms of the opportunities that we have in agriculture, some are better than others. And the one that I'm describing is incredibly robust just because it really is how the soils got their carbon in the first place, is through not disturbing the soil. Like you look at the NRCS soil health criteria, the 4 elements of soil health, I wrote them down here. They're minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, maximize living roots, and maximize biodiversity. That is a natural ecosystem that's just been described there. And what is not on the NRCS website is an acknowledgement of how hard it is to get an annual cropping system to do these things. And so if you have a perennial polyculture, you've just achieved all 4 of those primary criteria that the NRCS, Soil Health Institute, all of these organizations have identified as, and it's not surprising because it is actually a description of all of the natural ecosystems that built these soils that we rely on in agriculture in the first place. Our agriculture is not currently building these soils. We inherited it from those ecosystems. And so, that's a pitch for perennial polycultures with respect to accumulating soil carbon. But we're very hesitant to suggest that it is, well, we simply don't suggest that it will fix climate change. It's just a key part of what needs to happen.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that that's really important because I think right now people are, I think under the idea that if we change our agriculture, we can continue as is. And I think it's not quite that silver bullet, but it is definitely part of the solution. So yeah, thank you for that clarification. How are perennial crops being incorporated into foods?
Well, little by little, we don't have very many shovel-ready perennial grain crops yet. Perennial crops in general are already in foods. They're apples, they're nuts, they are berries. There's so many perennial crops out there, but most of them are woody. And so in terms of herbaceous, meaning kind of plants that come up out of the ground every year, there's not nearly as many of those. And like I've said, there's almost no grains. And so in terms of the grains that we're working on, Kernza is the species that has started to be adopted in the US. And yet it's a huge education for the Land Institute and others that are very enthusiastic about Kernza to understand the difficulty of establishing a supply chain with supply and demand, that it's functional geographically, it makes sense. And then you throw in weather and my gosh, incentives through NRCS. All of these factors come into play in trying to introduce a new crop species that the public has not eaten before. And it's challenging, but there's a lot of enthusiasm around it, and I think that it's very promising that it will continue to move forward and be adopted into many products. We're having a challenge in Europe right now because the European Food Safety Administration has been considering granting Kernza novel food status for several years now, but has not done it yet. And so at this moment, you cannot buy a product that has Kernza in it in the EU, even though if you go to the Land Institute's website and look at our global research partners map, there are about as many across Europe as there are in the US, especially around Kernza, because they are extremely excited about it over there. And so, yet another example of a barrier to adoption that most people wouldn't even think or wouldn't know exists, that something like that is there. We have our own version of it in the US. It's not as challenging. It's not as rigorous. Some people might think that's good. Some people may not. I can tell you that the EU has maybe some things that I think we would want to consider adopting, but it's a little bit overboard. And right now we're into an area that is very surprising how slow they are being. And I don't really understand why. It's kind of an opaque system, but anyway, it's a challenge.
What do you think the future of perennial crops will be like and how people will use them?
Well, if our vision is that eventually perennial grains will replace annual grains. That's a huge statement. It's a very far-reaching, far-looking statement into the future. You can always terminate a perennial crop whenever you want. And so, you could grow it as an annual if for some reason you decide, oh, I don't want to do this in this field. I need to shift it and make it into something else. So it's not like somehow it's all one way or the other. But the benefits that I've described, and I haven't described all of them. I mean, think of the farmer who doesn't have to make that many tractor passes, or if you're in a part of the world where you're doing most of the labor by hand or with animal traction, reduce labor, it would just be incredible in many people's lives. And I think we might romanticize certain existence of traditional farmers, but there's no question that both reduced labor would be welcome, and it increases the energy return on investment that I was describing earlier. If you don't have to terminate the vegetation, if you're not losing 50% of the nitrogen in your system because there's no roots to take it up, you don't have to go accumulate that 50% of the nitrogen, whether by hauling manure or by the amount of legume you incorporate into your farming system. You just don't even have to go get it because you're not losing it. Things like this would be game changers for farmers. And I think that the speed with which it would be adopted, these perennial grains or perennial grain cropping systems, would rival that of Roundup Ready soybeans, because in future energy scenarios that I'm imagining, we will probably need to downpower some. We're not going to have the discretionary energy that we do today at our fingertips. So we will be looking hard for agricultural systems that grow themselves more and don't rely on human intervention nearly to the degree that our food producing ecosystem requires today. So so the future, in the short term, there's going to be incremental adoption, trial and error, successes, failures. It's the story of agriculture. But in the long run, we really hope to see a global transformation.
What do you think are the most important things for society to do to shift towards sustainable agriculture systems?
Well, I think there's the Michael Pollan's statements. There's eat mostly plants, waste less food. All of these are very important. All of them are very important. Maybe eat more local food that is locally adapted, as opposed to local food that was grown locally because we made parts of Salina similar to Santa Cruz, California, with hoop houses and row covers and drip systems and all of the energy it takes to turn Salina into coastal California. That's how some of our local food functions today. And energetically, I'm not sure that is a sustainable option. It's good for the economy, but not as sustainable ecologically. But in the long run, I think that an eye towards perennializing cropping systems in general, and not just grains, but in tree crops, in pasture-raised livestock, basically making sure that as much of the planet's soils are covered with the vegetation that all natural ecosystems have developed, is critical. So that would be my 2 cents, is to perennialize as much as possible.
Is there anything else you'd like to share or add?
Well, no, just that it's been a pleasure. You ask a lot of really good questions, and hopefully that this has made some sense.
It was
I know it's most people don't think about perennials. Most people don't think about energy very much. But when you step back and look at our planet, those are absolutely essential to understand life as life on this earth. All other organisms have to deal with not working harder, not burning more calories to go get their food than they spend. Or let me say that again. All other organisms have to get more energy out of their food than they spend in getting it. Every single one of them. It's so strange that we have decoupled from that, and it's very recent. We got to keep that in mind. And so it's allowed us to do all sorts of things, even in organic agriculture. But I think it's time to reckon with limits, and in doing so, agriculture becomes a very different activity than the way we're thinking about it right now.
Thank you so much for this excellent interview. I really appreciate all the science you dove into, and it's been really great having you on the podcast. Thank you so much, Tim.
All right, Rosemary, take care.